We welcome you to today's webinar brought to you by OraSure Technologies 2021, What a Year. We'd like to thank OraSure Technologies for hosting today's webinar. OraSure Technologies is a global leader in oral fluid substance abuse testing products. Their unique assays provide accurate and easy to administer testing methods to help determine the presence or absence of drugs or alcohol in a person's system. The Intercept Oral Fluid Drug Test is an FDA-cleared, laboratory-based oral fluid drug testing system that enables accurate testing for 9 drugs of abuse, including marijuana, cocaine, PCP, amphetamines, methamphetamines, barbiturates, benzodiazepines, methadone, and opiates. Intercept is fast and easy to administer and is ideal for workplace, criminal justice, drug treatment centers, clinical setting screening programs, and more. Today's presentation pre-qualified for continuing education credit from SHRM, CCDAP, and from HRCI for those who attend today's presentation in its entirety. You'll receive information following today's webinar on how to receive those credits. Today's presenters are Bill Current from the Current Consulting Group and Jackie Perrone from OraSure Technologies. Jackie is the program leader for OraSure Technologies Risk Assessment Division. She has 25 years of experience in drug testing and has worked for OraSure for the past 10 years and with Roche Diagnostic Corporation for 15 years prior to joining OraSure. She's responsible for the global direction as well as the financial and market growth of drugs of abuse and risk assessment product lines. Bill Current is the author of Why Drug Testing Updated and Expanded for 2020, as well as 9 other books on substance-related issues. He founded the Current Consulting Group in 1998, and it has become the #1 recognized brand name in compliance, business development, and operations consulting in the drug testing industry. And with that, we'll go ahead and turn the virtual microphone over to Bill.
Well, thank you very much, Jessica, and welcome everyone to today's webinar presentation hosted by OraSure Technologies. I'm really excited about today's presentation in particular because I get to co-present with one of my favorite people in my 30+ years in the industry, Jackie Perrone from OraSure Technologies. Jackie and I have known each other a long time, dating back to her years with Roche Diagnostics. And we've done a lot of presentations together over the years. And I'm always learn something every time I'm with Jackie and we're making a presentation together. So I'm really excited about today's presentation. We're going to talk a little bit about how 2021 has gone. You know, we came into the year, you know, sort of with COVID, hopefully in our rearview mirror, and it's just kept on and kept on and kept on in one way or another. And so we're going to talk a little bit about COVID's impact on substance abuse and on workplace drug testing in particular. We'll look at trends in drug panels, where marijuana fits into that whole equation. We're going to talk about recent use detection and marijuana, because marijuana is still, you know, sort of the big topic when it comes to drug testing. And then we'll talk about the growth of oral fluid drug testing in the workplace. I'm going to start out with an introduction, and then I'll talk a little bit about the impact of COVID on substance abuse and on the workplace. But this introduction is sort of a catch-all section to capture several very important trends that sort of all come together as one category. So we made it into an introduction. I get asked all the time about, you know, what's the future of drug testing look like? And I think to answer that question, you have to look at the trends that were significant in 2021. For example, I think going forward, we're going to see more impact on the workplace from COVID-19. I don't think COVID-19 and COVID testing and COVID safe practices in the workplace are going anywhere anytime soon. I think those are here to stay for the long term. I think we'll see more marijuana legislation or legalization, because that's what we saw in 2021. We'll talk about that. Restrictions on workplace drug testing, a big development in New York. We're going to talk about that, and I think we'll see more of that in the future. More positive drug test results, absolutely. We saw that, we're seeing it. All the data is not in from 2021, but I think we're going to see that coming up next year, and more oral fluid testing. I've got some stats to share with you on that. So let's start with the impact of COVID-19 on the workplace and on substance abuse. So there are lots of studies. If you do a Google search right now on the pandemic, COVID-19, the pandemic, some combination of those words, and drug abuse, you'll find numerous sites that are using studies and reports that are showing that since the start of COVID in around roughly, in March of 2020, until through the end of this year, there have been significant increases in drug abuse. Drug abuse overdoses, drug abuse overdose fatalities, et cetera, and positive drug test results in the workplace. And that's going to continue, but it's a trend that started with COVID and has just continued through 2021. We really haven't seen that let up yet. And another impact of COVID on the workplace is the ongoing use of remote workforces, employees working from home. And I've got some stats coming up on that, but that's a very interesting trend as it impacts workplace drug testing and drug-free workplace programs generally. COVID-19 testing in the workplace, I've got some stuff coming up on that, and vaccine mandates. And those are entangled in the courts right now, but the OSHA requirements per the administration's vaccine mandates is on hold. It's suspended for the time being. But all of this has had an impact on work life for Americans. More drug abuse, working from home, COVID testing. Will we be required to have a vaccine or not? And how do we prove that? And as an employer, how do you manage all of that data? Because it's just a huge amount of data, especially if you're a really large company. You're talking about thousands upon thousands upon thousands of records that have to be kept of people who have been vaccinated, those who have not, what's the status of their COVID testing, are they being tested every week, depending on what happens with those OSHA guidelines, et cetera. And so all of this is sort of on the minds of employers as we go into the new year. And some of these trends are definitely going to continue into 2022. The remote workers, yes, absolutely. You look at that first bullet, prior to the pandemic, only about 7% of employees completely worked from home or worked remotely. And now we're seeing that up in the 30 and 30% plus category of individuals who consider themselves either hybrid workers, where they spend a couple of days in the office and a couple of days at home every week, or complete, absolute 100% remote workers. All at the Current Consulting Group, we're all remote workers. We always have been. It was not a big change for us, but everybody in our company works remotely. We have people as far away as Hawaii, as far north as Wisconsin, and everywhere else throughout the country. That's a common occurrence now with many companies. Many companies not ready to go full 100% back in the workplace with everybody together. That trend will continue into next year. In fact, in some cases, many companies will permanently go to either a hybrid or a 100% remote workforce. That's a trend that really sort of skyrocketed during COVID, and it's going to stay that way. If you think back to Election Day 2020, 5 states voted to legalize marijuana: Arizona, Montana, Mississippi, New Jersey, and South Dakota. Now, Mississippi's medical marijuana law was put on hold by the state Supreme Court, so that's still in a little bit of a limbo state. South Dakota legalized both recreational and medical marijuana, and there's been a little bit of a hold or suspension put on their legal marijuana law because of some conflicts with the state constitution. But generally, you saw the trend continuing in 2020. In 2021, even more states have now legalized marijuana, either for medicinal or in most cases for recreational use. Every state that has a recreational drug use law, sometimes called adult use laws, had a medical marijuana law in place at the same time. The only exception to that is South Dakota, which voted to legalize both medical marijuana and recreational marijuana at the same time. So Connecticut, New Jersey, New Mexico, New York, and Virginia all had medical marijuana laws already, and now they have recreational marijuana laws as well. So the vast majority of states, 39 states, including the District of Columbia, have legalized marijuana one way or the other, either for medicinal uses or for adult use or recreational use. So it's the majority of states now fall into that category. We'll see more of that in the future. If you look at a map, most of the states that have legalized marijuana are still medical marijuana states. But we saw legislation not get through in 2021 to make recreational use legal in many of those medical marijuana states. We'll see those bills come back up again at the state level in 2022, and more states will legalize recreational use of marijuana. Now, as part of some of these medical marijuana and especially recreational marijuana laws, there have been some conditions placed on workplace drug testing. And by that, I'm referring to non-discrimination clauses in those laws that prohibit an employer from discriminating against a legal user of medical marijuana. For example, if somebody's a registered medical marijuana user, you can't refuse to hire them based solely on those grounds. There have been some laws that have been put in place that require employers to show proof of impairment in addition to a positive test result for marijuana before an employer can take some type of adverse employment action. New York, the state of New York went a step further. So New York voted to legalize, or the governor actually legalized recreational marijuana in 2021, and then authorized the State Department of Labor to come out with guidelines for that would regulate or place conditions on testing for marijuana in the workplace. We didn't expect what we got, but the state of New York, the Department of Labor came out and essentially, there's some nuances in this, okay, there's some loopholes, but essentially prohibited virtually all forms of workplace testing for marijuana, including pre-employment and random testing for marijuana. There are some exceptions to that, but New York becomes the most restrictive state in the country when it comes to workplace drug testing for marijuana. The exceptions are in what I would term reasonable suspicion or post-accident testing situations where there's articulable symptoms of impairment. Now, the Department of Labor guidelines do not define what that means, what articulable symptoms of impairment is, but it does talk about situations where there's been a decrease or lessen the performance by the individual of their duties and their tasks, and when it interferes with the company's obligation to provide a safe and healthy workplace. Now, there are other exceptions to this, but look at that last bullet. With all of these potential exceptions that may still justify testing for marijuana in certain situations, an employer still cannot use a positive test for marijuana as the sole justification for adverse employment action. There still has to be some other reason to justify that adverse employment action. You get a positive test for marijuana after an accident, you still have to show some connection between the accident and any damage or harm that was caused and the positive test for marijuana. New York is still an open book as far as I'm concerned. I think we'll see some legal challenges to it. I think there'll be some more definition added to it. There's already been some confusion about the New York law and the city of New York's city ordinance, which only limits pre-employment testing for marijuana. And even then, there's a long list of safety sensitive positions that are exempt from that prohibition, and it only applies to pre-employment testing for marijuana. So I think there's still some confusion. I think that'll all get worked out. But I do think that in 2022 and beyond, we're going to see more states trying to do something like what New York has done. I think we'll see that in California, perhaps, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Nevada, maybe Illinois. Nevada already has a very strict law when it comes to pre-employment testing for marijuana. So I think we'll see some movement in that direction. I think if you're a company that offers a test just for marijuana, you're probably in trouble, because I think there's going to be some movement there, and I've got some stats to show with you that fewer and fewer companies are testing for marijuana, and it's not even in states like New York and Illinois and Nevada that already limit testing for marijuana. Now, a lot of this, the pandemic and the challenge employers have had to get traditional collections done of urine samples at offsite collection sites, at occupational health centers, et cetera, where sick people gather. The need during this really tight hiring market to be able to do a collection on site, maybe even with a rapid result, has combined to create this opening for oral fluid testing that has, in my opinion, from all the data we've been able to collect from the Quest Drug Testing Index, from the surveys that the Current Consulting Group does every year, which are co-sponsored by OraSure, those have led us to believe that probably the fastest growing segment of the drug testing industry is oral fluid testing. If you look at that first bullet, midway through last year, we did a survey to see, what impact is the pandemic having on drug testing methods. And about 13% of providers said they had clients already switched to or add oral fluid testing. By the end of the year, when we redid the survey again, that 13% had increased to 15%. And when we did an employer version of the survey, 17.5% said that they had already either switched to or added oral fluid testing. We think that oral fluid testing was about 8% or so of the drug testing market prior to the pandemic. We believe now for sure it's at least 12%, but probably closer to 15%. Now, there was a question submitted to the survey or to the webinar today that we'll get to at the end, but it was the, what impact do you think DOT adding oral fluid testing will have on, companies doing oral fluid testing? And I think at that point, the floodgates just open. I think in the next 3 years, 5 years, whatever it's going to take, I think oral fluid testing will probably be a solid, probably 40 to 50% of the drug testing market, just because of the trend that we're seeing, and it's continued into 2021. When in this year's survey, when we asked providers, do you offer lab-based oral fluid testing to your clients? You can see the light bar is 2019, then 2020, then 2027. So you saw the no go down from 64% to 27% between 2019 and 2021. And then you saw on the flip side, the yeses go from 36% in 2019 to 73% in 2021. In other words, the drug testing providers, the industry itself, is reacting to these trends by offering lab-based oral fluid testing as an alternative so that clients can still get their drug tests done. And that's a trend that we saw last year. You see the light blue bar in the middle of those two groupings, and then it continued in 2021 in a significant way. Now, let's talk a little bit about COVID's impact on substance abuse and workplace drug testing. So again, we're going to use some statistics here. This is a report that came out from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. It comes out from SAMHSA every year. Did not come out this year, but there was a reason for that, pandemic related. But we know that before the pandemic, the 2019 results that came out in 2020, that marijuana use was already up significantly. It had increased from 15.9% to 17.5%, a significant increase no matter how you look at it. Other drug areas like psychotherapeutic drugs had fallen from 6.2 to 5.9 coming into 2020. In 2020, I think when we see data for 2020 and 2021, we'll see that category of psychotherapeutic drugs, the anti-anxiety medications, antidepressants, et cetera, that will have gone up significantly from the start of COVID. So we'll see some increases there. We also know that amphetamines were up, opioids were up, et cetera, from drug test results from various companies. Now, to sort of show where we're at with marijuana use from just one slice of society, we picked the Monitoring the Future survey that did come out this year. And it shows that there has been a steady increase over the last 5 years of marijuana use among young adults. This is significant because as we look at who's applying for jobs, who's coming out of college looking for their first job, et cetera, that's a large segment of the applicant pool right there. And that's also the slice of society, the demographic that has the highest rate of drug abuse and the highest rate of marijuana use. So just looking at marijuana, you can see that it did go up. Now, interestingly, right, look at that third bullet, 44% reported using marijuana in 2020 compared to 38% in 2015. So a pretty significant jump over that 6-7 year period. But look at the last bullet. For young adults not in college, those are for college students. For those not in college, the annual marijuana use remained at 43%. So you're thinking, oh, good, it didn't go up, right? It's been around 43% for the last 3 years, and 43%, just like the 44% of the college students, is a significant percentage. So if you're hiring from that demographic, you've got to look at those numbers and you've got to say to yourself, yeah, we got to be careful. I'm not sure as a company we can afford to not test for marijuana if we're hiring from this category. And you may say, well, if I test for marijuana, I'm not going to be able to find anybody to hire. I don't think that's true. There's no indication that that's true in a widespread nation-to-nation, industry-by-industry evaluation. But it also isn't wise because as employers, you're still responsible for what your employees do. So if you remove testing for marijuana, which some companies are doing, we've got some stats coming up on that. If you test marijuana from remove it from your drug test panel, and you're hiring more marijuana users who are not really deterred from using marijuana in the morning before work, maybe during work, et cetera, there's a greater likelihood of an accident or something bad happening that you as an employer are going to be held legally responsible for under respondeat superior, and negligent hiring laws. You've got to be able to show that you made a good effort to identify those drug users before you hired them. And marijuana being the #1 drug of abuse is got to be one of your concerns. Now, we know when COVID started, this was a report that just came out this past summer, that cannabis sales shot through the roof because marijuana in states that had legalized it was deemed by most governors to be an essential medicine. And so marijuana use and marijuana sales through legal channels continued throughout the pandemic and into 2021. We're looking at just 4 states there, right? Alaska, Colorado, Oregon, Washington, all states that have legalized marijuana for recreational use as well. In all 4 of those states, the second bullet shows those increases were greater than the percent increases observed in the preceding 2 years. So we know that the pandemic had a significant impact on legal sale of cannabis. Now look at the last bullet though. According to the website Marijuana Moment, there's lots of these websites that track the cannabis industry. Quote, elsewhere in the US, cannabis sales have similarly grown. Illinois, for instance, saw $127.8 million in total sales last month, July 2021, breaking its monthly sales record for the 4th time in the past 5 months. So in other words, July, June, going back 5 months, record sales every 4 of those 5 months. So marijuana sales, very healthy, but tied to this pandemic-related trend that we were seeing in other areas of more marijuana use and more people testing positive for marijuana in the workplace. This is just one company's experience, right? You look at the far left, it shows 2019 versus 2020, and marijuana positive drug test results from random testing went up about 20%. So up in any given year, we would have been, just appalled by that, a 20% increase in positives in marijuana. But look to the right of this bar graph. Look at over there under opioids. Opioids went up, positives from random testing went up over 270%, almost 274% between 2019 and 2020, and amphetamines were up over 215%. So in other words, it's not just about marijuana when it comes to the workplace and creating and maintaining a safe and healthy workforce. You've got to be concerned about these other drugs as well. Even if you're a company that's been tempted to remove marijuana from your drug test panel, which I personally don't think is a wise decision from a business standpoint, you can't do away with drug testing altogether, because we're seeing also, since the start of the pandemic, a significant increase in the usage and positive drug test results in the workplace in other drug categories, particularly opioids and amphetamines. Alcohol use on the job, yeah, alcohol sales skyrocketed at the beginning of COVID, but in 2021, we've seen that alcohol abuse levels have stayed up high. So 1 in 3 Americans more likely to drink alcohol during work hours while working from home, right? That's a reference back to that remote workforce trend. 36% of men, 26% of women said they drink on the clock. Overall, the last bullet, overall alcohol consumption up 14%, heavy drinking 18, almost 19%, and other forms, the way the federal government categorizes this is you've got binge drinking, which is having at least 5 drinks on one occasion at least once in the last 30 days. Heavy drinking is having at least 5 drinks on at least 5 occasions in the last 30 days. And so we saw alcohol consumption up generally at 14%, but heavy drinking up almost 19%. The drug testing industry as a whole lost volume in drug testing. So if this pie here shows, if you look over to the left at about 8 o'clock on the dial here, the percentage of companies that said that they lost between 21 and 40% of their drug testing volume was 28%. 28% of companies said it had dropped somewhere in that range of 21 to 40%. On the other side, around the 5 o'clock part of the dial, 25% of companies said that they had seen a drop of between 11 and 20%. So essentially what we're looking at here is about 53% of drug testing providers saying that their volume had dropped. That doesn't mean, excuse me, that means their volume had dropped. It doesn't mean companies stopped doing drug testing or stopped doing something with that provider, but there was a drop in drug testing volume. I think that has probably settled. I don't think that it's at that 53% level anymore, but I think that there has been sort of a vacuum where some volume of the drug testing has been sucked out. Is marijuana having a negative impact on drug testing sales? To the left, about 8 o'clock, 31% don't agree with that statement. On the right at about 2 o'clock, 33% do agree with that statement. So about a third of the industry says yes, marijuana, legal marijuana is hurting us. About the same percentage say no, 21% neutral. Some don't really know the answer to that question. The same survey indicated that some clients are coming back. And this is a good trend, right? So look at the top there. We did not lose any clients due to the pandemic, 29%. So good for all of you. 11% we've had no clients that we lost due to the pandemic return in 2021. That's not good. But then you see the percentages after that. 61% saying, or 14% said 61% or plus had come back. 7%, somewhere around 41 to 60%, and on down the line here. My point is that there were companies that suspended their drug testing during COVID, and many of them have come back. About a third of the clients never left, and some haven't come back yet. But generally speaking, I think those volumes are going up. If, as a result of the pandemic, the industry lost 25% of drug testing volume, which is a percentage that many experts think is probably realistic, it's starting to come back up again. So will we capture all of it? Maybe not in 2022, but we're going in that direction. COVID testing, here's a surprising thing, right? So when asked if you're providing COVID testing, which is a big trend and a natural connection to the drug testing industry, only 35% said yes, 50% said no, and they had no plans to do that. Now, I will say that 50% who are not offering COVID and have no plans to do that is about the same as, or excuse me, it's about the same as what we saw last year. That little blue slice of the pie at about 5 o'clock, no, but we're considering it, that's about the same too, 15 to 16%. So we just really haven't moved in this area, which I think if you're a company that's offering COVID testing, that just opens up the market for you, because COVID testing is just not going to go away. There are some challenges to it, as identified by a survey participants, but I think COVID testing is here to stay. And if you're looking for ways, excuse me, if you're looking for ways to increase your revenue and add value to your services, COVID testing is a way to go. And with that, I'll turn it over to Jessica for our first poll question.
Thank you, Bill. We are going to start out with a question. What is the most prevalent drug testing trend you have noticed in 2021? I'll go ahead and launch that poll so that you can participate with us. So what is the most prevalent drug testing trend you have noticed in 2021? And if you would share with us, more positive drug test results, less pre-employment drug testing, less drug testing overall, maybe a combination of A and B, a combination of A and C. And since we can only have 5 options, if none of these apply to you, but you'd like to share with us, you could use the chat or question section to type in your response, and we appreciate that as well. Otherwise, we'll just give you another few seconds to join with us. Okay, it looks like we're slowing down a little bit, so I'm going to go ahead and close this poll, and I'm going to launch it and share the results with you. So the most prevalent drug testing trend that you all have noticed in 2021 is more positive drug test results at 54%. No one saw less pre-employment drug testing, but we have seen less drug testing overall with 21%. And then we have seen an A and B about 14% and A and C at 11%. And so we have a couple of people posted in that they have seen less drug testing, and more positive alcohol abuse have been shared with us in the comments. So thank you for that feedback as well. I'm going to go ahead and hide the poll at this time. And with that, I'm going to turn the virtual microphone over to Jackie to share with us a little bit more about trends in drug panels.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And actually, before we get to that, just a quick comment on the poll. I think what you'll see in the next couple of slides really kind of vets that out. and a lot of what Bill talked about previously, which is we're just seeing a lot more positives out there. And one of the things that we'll talk about is, it may be some drugs that you might not be thinking about that are some of these positives. And so kind of expanding what you think about a drug testing panel really is. And so with that, this first bullet, the drug testing panel is a term used to describe drugs included in a drug test. And it could just be one drug, or it could be several drugs. It could be a multitude, really depending on where you are, what market segment you're in. Most of us are probably in the workplace market, but there are a lot of drug treatment or pain management. When they look at a drug testing panel, they could be looking at 12 to 15 different drugs. And we'll talk a little bit later, when you look at opiates, or let's say benzodiazepines as a class of drugs, there are other drugs that kind of fall within that class. So opiates, you've got heroin, 6-acetylmorphine, hydrocodone, hydromorphone, oxycodone, all kind of fall within that opiate class. So the days, and as Jessica mentioned at the very beginning, I've been in the drug testing industry for over 25 years. So I remember the term NIDA-5 instead of the SAMHSA-5. And when you think about, our average of 5 drugs, it isn't necessarily 5 drugs any longer. It may be a class of drugs, but within that class, we've expanded the number of drugs we're testing for. And so it'll be interesting. I think we've got a poll question on a little bit later on how many drugs you all are actually, or your customers are testing for. And I would bet that it's more than 4 or 5 that kind of we were used to years ago. So again, when you think about, what that drug panel, it can consist of just, 1 or 2 drugs, several drugs, or even, upwards of a dozen or maybe even more, depending on your industry and your needs. You can also really depend on state laws or limitations. Bill talked a little bit about marijuana and that being a limitation in some places. And so that would be one less drug that many folks are probably doing at this point in time. Federal regulations. So you look at marijuana, that is still a part of the federal guidelines. So it's still part of DOT, it's still part of the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and anybody that falls under those federal regulations. So again, looking at those state regulations as well as federal regulations, as well as the type of work. There's a big difference. Bill mentioned a lot of people are working remotely these days. There are still quite a few people that are going into a physical job. They may be on a production line, they may be in a warehouse, they may be in oil, gas, mining. Those types of jobs tend to be more safety sensitive. And so we think about drug testing perhaps a little bit different with those types of jobs where you're physically in a location, and by using drugs or being impaired on the job, you can physically harm yourself or someone else, as opposed to perhaps somebody like me right now who's sitting, in my office talking to you guys via webinar. So there may be some differences there. Drug testing method as well, and we'll talk a little bit more about rapid result versus lab-based and the flexibility there. And then in some cases, the corporate policy or culture. I know here in the United States, we do a lot of testing on a pre-employment basis as well as post-accident, post-employment. In other countries, they don't do nearly as much workplace testing. So their corporate policy or their culture, if you will, is very different than what we experience here in the United States. So all those things kind of wrap themselves into what that drug testing panel might look like, and it's going to be very different for so many different folks. The federal drug testing panel, I mentioned that a few minutes ago. And so again, the SAMHSA-5, so it's a 5-panel test. But if you notice here, while we've got amphetamines, cocaine, marijuana, opiates, and PCP, so we've got 5 drug classes here. You'll also notice that there are a number of different drugs within that class. Amphetamines, as an example, not only do you have amphetamine, but you have methamphetamine. You also may be looking for ecstasy, MDMA. For cocaine, you're looking primarily at cocaine, but also the metabolite in many cases, the benzoylecgonine. Marijuana, one thing that we have kind of on here is, the cannabinoids. So we always often look for Delta 9, but we are also seeing a rise right now in other types of deltas, if you will. Delta 8 is out there, and that's more of a synthetic. If you remember, several years ago, we started seeing crack, spice, and K2 and things like that. Well, now we're seeing something called Delta 8, and I believe there's also a Delta 10, which are synthetic cannabinoids. And in some cases, they are very much more potent than our current cannabinoids, the Delta 9 that we see. And so you'll probably, if you've not started hearing about those in the news, you'll probably start hearing about those soon, because it is actually one of those loopholes right now where it's not necessarily federally illegal. It's also not being tested for. And so people that do realize that it's out there are getting their hands on it, and they're being able to use it and not be detected by it. But it is an impairing substance as well. Under the opiate class, we talked a little bit ago, heroin, codeine, morphine, but then again, you also have your oxys and your hydros that are in there, as well as 6-acetylmorphine. And we're also going to spend a little bit of time talking about fentanyl in a few moments, which falls under the opiate class as well. And then you've got PCP. So the point on this slide really is, while it is a 5-panel drug test, there are way more than 5 drugs that are typically being tested for. The biggest drug testing panel trend in 2021, I think Bill alluded to this a little bit, sort of a continued decrease in the number of companies that are testing for marijuana. Couple of reasons, several reasons. Big companies are reacting to social pressures. When you see Amazon, one of the largest employers here in the United States, actually back off and stop testing for marijuana, that says a lot. And if you're a small company or a company in kind of a similar niche market, you kind of take the lead from some other companies. So certainly that's something that we're kind of all wrestling with right now. One of the biggest things is just the way that people think about marijuana. If you had looked at 10, 15 years ago, preponderance of the number of people that approved of marijuana use was in the minority, probably 20, 25, maybe 30%. And it's completely flipped now, where we've got 65, 70% of people that approve of marijuana, both medically as well as recreationally. And as Bill mentioned, that college age or that young adult, they've kind of grown up the last number of years, realizing that marijuana is becoming, from a society, much more acceptable. And so that's certainly, part of what that trend looks like. Bill mentioned also some states, specifically New York, that have legalized marijuana and make it more difficult to test for cannabis. There are certainly circumstances, as he mentioned, that it is allowable. And I agree with Bill. I do think that as time goes on, we're going to see more and more states kind of looking like this. So you kind of wonder, in the next 3, 4, 5, 7 years, what is it going to look like from a marijuana perspective? And certainly employers are confused about their legal right to test for marijuana. In this ever-changing world that we have, what am I allowed to do? What am I going to get in trouble for? Am I going to get sued for something that I shouldn't be able to do, or should be able to do? So that all kind of wraps into it. One thing that is not on here, but Bill did touch on a little bit, is just the number of companies that are still looking to hire folks, hire them back from the pandemic, looking for work. We know that, there's many help wanted signs out there. I just go into any restaurant and half the time it's only half occupied because they only have 1 or 2 servers. And so now if you add in the restriction of, well, I'm going to test for marijuana and you have to be clean, That's another issue that people are facing. And kind of tied to that is also, hey, I live in what we call sort of a donut hill or donut hole. All the states around me legalized marijuana and I have not. So I'm, you know, if I'm still testing for it, I could be losing those employees to across the border where they're not worried about testing for marijuana. So certainly a trend that we need to continue to keep our eyes on for sure. Bill has talked a little bit about the 2021 survey, and one of the questions that was asked is, how have companies already eliminated marijuana from their panel? And what you can see here is a resounding 63% say that yes, they have. There were about 8% that were neutral, 13% that did not know, and only 16% disagree. This question has been asked for the last couple of years on the drug testing survey that CCG has done. And if you were to have looked at this 2 or 3 years ago, it would have been flip-flopped in the other direction, with most saying they disagree as opposed to agree. So we certainly are seeing we're seeing things change. That same survey found that one of the main reasons companies discontinue has to do with legal concerns. And again, companies don't want to get in trouble. They want to make sure that their policy is sound and they're doing the right thing, but it is very confusing. You know, every time you turn around, it seems like there's a new law, whether it's your state or city within your state. Like Bill had talked about in New York, what happens for New York State may be different than what happens in New York City. And so that's also a little bit, concerning to a lot of the employers that are out there. Okay, so I just really quickly showed 2 folks on the screen here. And if this was a live audience, I'd ask if anybody recognizes these 2 gentlemen. But I'm assuming that most of you probably know the one on the left is Tom Petty, the one on the right is Prince. What do these guys have in common? Unfortunately, both of them died from not only an accidental overdose of opioids, but they died from fentanyl as well. And fentanyl has become one of the probably the biggest trends or headlines in the last year to 2 years. I think everybody probably knows fentanyl is 30 to 50 times more potent than heroin. We've now seen this year 1/3 of the fatal overdoses are fentanyl related, and that passes heroin as the leading cause of overdose deaths. Unfortunately, this has been a very big year for us from a fentanyl perspective. And unfortunately, most people that are using it have no idea that they're using it. Fentanyl use is on the rise. It's highly addictive, and it's now being laced into other drugs. So what we saw 5, 6, 7 years ago were people that were taking fentanyl patches or fentanyl, what they call lollipops, and just using or abusing the fentanyl in and of itself. What we've seen now happen is not only is it being laced with opioids, which is the most common thing, where it's taken kind of in conjunction. Fentanyl is a pain medication, and that's why it's kind of that's why it's in the opioid class. If you look at Prince, one of the reasons he was taking it, he had bad hips. Tom Petty as well. You know, a lot of these musicians are on the stage, off the stage, jumping up and down, and doing that multiple times a day, and then every day for the year and years after years kind of takes its toll on you. But what we're seeing now is fentanyl is actually being used in conjunction with other drugs, cocaine, amphetamines, so on and so forth. So what's happening is it's sort of being used as filler, if you will. We all know that it just takes a little bit of fentanyl for someone to overdose and become a fatal event. But what's happening now is drug dealers are getting smart, and they know just enough fentanyl in many cases to lace in with other drugs to make the high more potent and make people come back, continuing to come back, without necessarily killing someone. So not only are we seeing fentanyl users unfortunately pass on, but we're seeing a lot more overdoses that are not resulting in death from fentanyl. In fact, I was talking to one of our clients not very long ago, and they talked about, this is in a drug treatment setting, 40% of all of their positives, and these are living, breathing people, 40% have fentanyl in them. And that's a scary thought when you think about how little it takes to flip from an overdose, getting high situation to an overdose death situation. So here you can see it's the most, one of the most common drugs involved in drug overdose deaths. 93,000 people died of a drug overdose in 2020. That's the highest amount ever. And I think part of that is due to the pandemic. Part of that is due to the increase in fentanyl that we're seeing. That does represent a 30% increase as compared to 2019. And synthetic opioid fatalities rose by an unprecedented 55% during the 12 months ending in September 2020. And I'm sure as time goes on, we're going to see those numbers continue to hold. So when employers ask what drugs should we test for, the answer plain and simple is test for the drugs that people use, and know that people are using many different drugs. And you know, it's not the standard 5 panel that we know and love from years ago. In addition, we haven't really talked about, but there are a number of other drugs that are kind of up and coming from a treatment perspective. A number of cities and states have legalized the use of mushrooms and some other hallucinogenics. And we don't know yet, but they may find their way into the mainstream. So those are things to be looking out for. Specifically, if you think somebody is under the influence and you've tried a number of drug and or alcohol tests and you're coming back with negatives, there may be something out there. And again, keep an eye out for Delta 8 and some of the other synthetic THCs out there. They are definitely making a comeback. When you think about panels, panels can be customized to add or remove drugs. So laboratory-based testing in and of itself offers the flexibility to add or remove a variety of tests very, very easily. Essentially, you just talk with the lab and say, I want to add or subtract this to my panel. Because everything is run on an instrument, and that instrument is very easily customized to what that panel looks like. You can do this for specific clients. You can add or drop, and many of the labs actually run the tests for things that you might not be thinking about. Ketamine is a good example. We don't see a lot of ketamine here, but it is seen in other parts of the world, and every once in a while you'll hear about a ketamine outbreak. Ketamine is not something that is often used, or you'll see, let's say, on a rapid test, for instance, but most labs will test for it, as well as a number of other drugs. And even as you think about alcohol, we're used to thinking about ethanol, but labs can test for things, you know, like ETG or ETS, that actually give you a little bit longer. The typical ethanol alcohol usually is out of your system in a matter of hours. ETG and ETS stay in the system for sometimes 24, 36, maybe even longer than that hours. So if you're worried about somebody ingesting on the job and they're coming up negative on an alcohol screen, that might be something to ask your lab about. Rapid testing also offers customizable panels, and there are a number of predetermined panels. The one thing that's a little bit different with rapid testing is there may be, you know, let's say 10 or 12 different rapid drug tests out there, all with different panels. You can customize them. There are standard panels, but when you buy your box, you're buying the box of, let's say, 25 7-panel tests or 25 8-panel tests. It's a little, basically you would need to stock a number of different types of rapid tests to get customizable panels. So it's easily done, but it's just not quite as flexible as lab testing, in that with a lab test, it's easy just to tell the lab, hey, switch this up for this particular client. For a rapid test, you can certainly do that, but you have to order a different set of rapid tests from your provider. And then choosing a test specimen that offers customizable panels in order to meet the state and federal regulatory requirements, whether that's hair testing, urine testing, oral fluid testing, or breath or something else that's out there. Know that you can vary your testing specimens as well as your menu. So we've got another poll question. I'm going to flip it over to Jessica to introduce this poll to the group.
Great, thank you so much, Jackie. So our quick question is, how many drugs do most employers test for? And this can come from your experience as an employer or your experience working with employers. Fewer than 5, 5, 7, 9, 11, or more. So if you want to just share with us real quick, or if you have a comment, you're welcome to put it into the question section. Okay, we're slowing down because that was a quick question. Let's go ahead and share the results with you. And we're looking at 3% say fewer than 5, 40% are at 5, 13% say 7, 27% said 9, and that was what we also got in the question section. And then 17% say 11 or more. And let me just double check those questions really quick. We did get some comments at 9 or 10 panels. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hide those results and turn it back over to Jackie to take us into the next section.
Okay, and just a quick comment, if I did the math correct, that would have been over 60% of the respondents said more than 5 drugs. So even though there was about 40% that said 5, there were quite a number of you that were above that 5 number. So again, very indicative, I think, of kind of our world today, that we're not just testing for 5 specific drugs. So this section is actually pretty quick, and then I'll turn it back over to Bill, and then we'll have a few minutes for some questions and answers. How important it is the ability to detect recent marijuana use. So this again goes back to the recent survey that CCG did, and you've got about 43% of the population that says it's important to be able to detect recent marijuana use. And about 40% were neutral. So really only about 17% disagree with that. And I think, again, here it really depends on, you know, what is the market segment that you're in? What type of job are you doing? I would probably bet that if you were safety sensitive, you were probably more in that agree segment as opposed to the disagree segment. Having a relatively shorter window of detection can certainly be an advantage. And I think, you know, we have a lot of folks that come on these webinars that join us every month to 6 weeks. So for many of you, you're probably very familiar with this chart, but it really looks at the different types of testing that's out there. So breath testing, blood, oral fluid, urine, and hair testing. And really what it shows is, you know, the number of, there are 3 basically, breath, blood, oral fluid, that relatively quickly, pretty much from the time of ingestion, just a few minutes after, you're able to detect that drug in the system. Urine takes a little bit longer, typically several hours, and that's because urine primarily looks at the metabolite of the drug, so it has to run through your system first. So that takes a few hours. And then hair testing actually takes about 7 to 10 days before the hair grows out enough to be able to detect the drug. So one of the advantages of using a method like breath, blood, or oral fluid is that, you know, in the very beginning, from when someone has ingested, you're able to detect that drug. And that could be very important if you've had an accident. So if you're looking at post-accident, you know, again, with marijuana being legal in many states from a recreational perspective, even medicinally, most states do have a carve out for not allowing for someone to be under the influence at work or use the drug at work. But it's very possible that somebody could go out during their lunch break or throughout some point in time of the day, come back in after just ingesting, And so one of those three methods would be a very good way to pick up the fact that somebody has been ingesting any drug, but marijuana specifically. Marijuana and impairment, just a real quick note on this. So there was a new report that found that cognitive impairment from marijuana use could last between 3 and 10 hours. And that varies depending on the THC level, frequency of use, how it's consumed, so on and so forth. One of the things that's really important to understand as you're looking at the three different methods, breath, oral fluid, and urine specifically, and we don't have hair on here because hair takes, again, 7 to 10 days to actually show a positive. So these are the methods that show a fairly quick positive result. One of the things to note is that breath testing typically only looks for something for about 3 to 4 hours. And if cognitive impairment can last up to 10 hours, you want to make sure that you're looking for a testing methodology that can actually last through that 10 hours. So both urine and oral fluid certainly can do that. So just a caution when you're looking at breath. Again, every method, there are pros and cons to all method, but it's important to understand and ensure that, you know, how you test, you really want it to cover the entire impairment hour, because if you're only covering that first 3 to 4 hours, and impairment can last longer than that, you may miss that positive in that person. And then our last poll is going to be, how important is recent use detection when testing for marijuana? So I'll hand it back over to Jessica for this last poll.
Thank you, Jackie. So let's see your thoughts on this. How important is recent use detection when testing for marijuana? Very important, mildly important, not important at all, or you don't know. Feel free to share with us your perspective. We won't criticize you if you don't know. I'll go ahead and we're getting these results in. Just know that if you have any questions for today's presenters, feel free to put them into the questions section. If we aren't able to get to them during the live portion of the webinar, we will have a representative reach out to you. I'm going to go ahead and close this, and we're going to share the results. And so 81% said very important, 16% said mildly important, 3% said not important at all, and no one is unsure or unaware. I'm going to go ahead and hide these results. Next section.
Okay, Jessica, so we just have a few minutes left. We have a section here on oral fluid. I just want to let everybody know if you're on today's webinar, you're going to get a link so that you can have these slides. So all the statistics and everything, they're going to be yours following today's presentation. Adding oral fluid testing to your drug testing program, we've talked about that. There are a couple of questions that have come in that I think are really for Jackie that I'm going to insert here in the next couple of minutes as we finish up today's webinar as part of this last section. And then if there are other things that you want to talk about, we'll stay on for just a couple of extra minutes to go over those things. We know that SAMHSA issued guidelines for lab-based oral fluid testing back in October of 2019. We thought we'd see those, some of the implementation period completed this year. It's still ongoing, but Jackie, what are you hearing from people in terms of the Department of Transportation coming out with guidelines for oral fluid testing?
Yeah, so we know that the DOT put kind of a placeholder for their notice to proposed rulemaking in last year. And I think that was actually about the time or right before the pandemic hit. And so there's been a lot of, back and forth at this point in time. We've heard through the grapevine that they're hoping to get something out soon, not sure what soon means. But we do know that the NLCP has been working diligently in North Carolina at RTP to get the lab certification process for oral fluid kind of up and running. And that's really more for the federal program as opposed to the DOT, because remember, there's two sides. When the guidelines came out at the end of 2019, that was really the federal guidelines. And so they're moving forward, and I think they're going to be ready to start certifying labs on the federal side very soon. And then the DOT should be falling with their notice of proposed rulemaking, hopefully very soon. That's what we've heard the latest.
Okay, and then also we know that OraSure, which again in this year's survey was recognized as the #1 brand in oral fluid testing, we know that you offer both lab-based oral fluid testing and rapid oral fluid testing. So just in a nutshell, what would be the advantage to one or the other depending on a company's situation, whether they would prefer lab? We see from the results here that 45% said that they would prefer lab-based, only 20% disagree with that. But what are you seeing sort of as the breakdown between why a company would choose one or the other?
Yeah, I think a lot depends really on how quickly you want to get the person up and running and hired. We see in a number of markets, staffing is one. In this tight labor market where you're really trying to get people on board as quickly as possible, rapid testing is a great way to get an answer quickly, rule out those negatives. More than 95% of your folks are going to be negative, and get them working right away. So we do have a number of folks that still rely on laboratory-based testing, but we're seeing a number of market segments, specifically retail distribution, staffing, really looking at rapid testing these days.
Okay, and then one of the other questions we asked was the FDA clearance versus non-FDA clearance. I think there's a lot of confusion on that, Jackie. So when we're talking about oral fluid testing, whether it's a lab-based test or a rapid result test, what does FDA clearance really mean? Why is it important?
Yeah, so, and in the workplace, it's interesting because we've got the traditional 510K laboratory, or both laboratory-based, and there are a few rapid products. There's only 2 actually that have a traditional 510K. And then we also have what's known as workplace and insurance testing. So if you're in the workplace field, you can use a product that is labeled as such, but it can only be used for workplace and insurance. So it can't be used in drug treatment or pain management. It really, you're looking for those markets, you're looking for a traditional 510K. So again, it really depends on your market and what your needs are. The federal government, as an example, and here I'm specifically talking about urine testing because we know oral fluid testing is not quite ready yet. But the federal government requires a 510K product. So the workplace insurance and exemption doesn't fit the need for, it's not part of the requirement for the federal government. You still must use a 510K product. So there are different levels of what the FDA looks for. So again, it really depends on your company, what type of testing you're doing, as to which direction you go as far as 510K or workplace exemption.
And on this slide, we see some of the advantages to oral fluid. I won't put Jackie on the spot because she's the marketing director for the #1 oral fluid testing company in the world. But I will say this, because Current Consulting represents lots of different companies, oral fluid, hair, urine testing, but we've seen a significant growth in oral fluid testing among our clients, which are typically the major providers of drug testing. And these are among the reasons, just because their clients are looking for an alternative that meets the current situation that they find themselves in. And we're about to close, but before we do, I want to give Jackie a chance to respond to a question that came in about alcohol testing. We really didn't talk about alcohol testing. We talked about alcohol abuse, but where do you see alcohol testing going in the next few years?
So it's interesting. We talk a lot about THC and the impairment side of things. We should always remember that alcohol is kind of in the same boat, right? So alcohol is a legal substance like THC, but it is an impairing substance. And so I do think that there are a lot of situations where, especially seeing the numbers that we have seen with people drinking, whether it's stress related, pandemic related, boredom, as people start coming back to work, are those people going to, have a continuing issue with alcohol? Is that something we as employers need to be looking for? So I do think, considering alcohol testing, or at least watching for signs of alcohol use or abuse, is going to be important as we get people back to work, just because we've seen such a large rise, not only in drug testing, but alcohol testing as well.
Thank you. Now we have one more poll question for our audience, but before we do that, let me answer a question, a last minute question that came in. There were several we didn't get to, but we will respond to all questions. But the question was asked when Jackie referred to a study that showed the window of impairment being 3 to 10 hours from a recent study that came out. They wanted to know the source of that. So that was the University of Sydney in Australia that came out with this report. Excuse me. If you just type in marijuana impairment Sydney or University of Sydney, you'll find it. But we will put the citation for that in our notes when we send that back out to you. So one last poll question just about today's webinar, and then we'll let you go. So Jessica, I'll turn that over to you.
Thank you so much, Bill, and for all of the participants. Well, you know that we're at that time again. So if you can stay with us for just a minute and help us with this question, we'd really appreciate it. The question is for continuing education credits. Would you watch these webinars regardless of CEU credits, or the option is I would not watch them without the CEU credits? Are the CEU credits imperative to your attendance? I'll just give you a minute if you wouldn't mind participating in this so that can help us with our planning. We appreciate your attendance always. I'll just give you one more second to participate. Go ahead and close that. Thank you. And then we actually have a follow-up question to that. And that question is, if CEU credits are important to you, which of the following are the most important? And all of them may be important to you, but if you would just share with us your most important: HRCI, CCDAC, SHRM, or none could also be other. So if there are other ones that are important to you, we'd be happy for you to share that with us. But at this time, which of the following are the most important to you? And then again, as we mentioned earlier, if you have a question that wasn't answered on today's live presentation, a representative will reach out to you. If you have questions in the future as you're reviewing these slides, the recording of these slides later, please reach out to your OraSure representative or us at Current Consulting Group, and we will help guide you to those answers you're looking for. I'm going to go ahead and close this poll as well. This last chart that's up on the board, this map, helps to identify the OraSure representatives in your area of the country. So if you haven't seen this before, go ahead and take a screenshot of it so you can make sure that you are reaching out to the OraSure representative in your area. And we'd like to thank all of those who attended today's webinar presentation. As mentioned at the very beginning, this presentation has qualified for continuing education, and if you're interested in those credits, we'll be sending that information out to those who qualify. We appreciate you being with us this year throughout 2021 on these OraSure webinars, and this concludes today's webinar presentation. Have a great day.